Nathan J. Robinson is quickly becoming king of all media. He is the editor of Current Affairs, a magazine to which I subscribe that I strongly recommend. He is also now part of the Current Affairs podcast, which has just launched, and we will talk about that. He is, in addition to all this, he is a PhD student in sociology and social policy. He is author of a couple of books, including Trump, Anatomy of a Monstrosity, and Super Predator, a book about Bill Clinton's relationship with the African American community in the U.S. And he joins us now. So first of all, Nathan, thanks for coming back on the program.
Well, it's so nice to be back on the program.
And secondly, I thought we would start out by welcoming the Current Affairs family to the community of broadcasters. This show is radio and TV, but we also have a podcast. You guys now have a podcast. And tell us about it.
Well, it seems obligatory for any print magazine to branch into podcasting sooner or later. So, but also with that, there are the wonderful things you can do with the medium, and we wanted to do interviews and conversations, and so we're branching out, and we've got a bi-weekly. It's every other week, and it's going to be a sort of discussion show with our editors. So we're going to take topics in the news, articles in the magazine, things that cross our minds. We're going to pitch ideas for how to make the world better. We're going to draw attention to problems that we don't think get enough attention, and just have what we think are good and thoughtful and provocative sometimes discussions about them. So we just launched on iTunes, and I think we're going on to Spotify and a couple other mediums. And we also have a Patreon page where people can have where our donors have exclusive content, and we're going to be releasing a lot of stuff through there.
So it's an ensemble podcast.
Yeah.
It's you and the other editors. And so it's kind of a big chill for the millennial left.
Yeah, well, it's like we're all getting together in a house to sort of hash out what we think of the world and how to fix it. Because we have a wonderful group of editors now. For a while, our magazine was basically just me and another guy, and now we sort of built up this incredible team of people, and they're all really smart and funny and wonderful and kind, and they all know so much, and so we want to get them together so that they can talk, because they are great together, and so we want to introduce the world to them. And on our website, you can meet everyone. We've got an article called "Introducing Current Affairs, the Podcast," in which all of our editors have written a little intro to themselves, a little bit about what they hope and expect from the podcast, and there's a picture of each of them.
Yeah, I read that actually, and I was struck by the fact that for some reason, I guess Pete Davis, your podmaster general, one of you guys started off by talking about what it must have been like to grow up in the 60s in a time of optimism, which of course you guys don't know firsthand. I do.
Yeah,
and
what was that like?
it was great, actually. It was awesome. And then it was like, oh God. So this is what it's really like.
Yeah. That's the problem with growing up in the 60s is then you had to live through the 80s.
And the 70s weren't great either. I mean, it was we had to tolerate the rise of REO Speedwagon, which made the 70s tough.
Oh my God. My sympathies.
Yeah, but I am optimistic for the future, as I think and hope you guys are. So before we get off the podcast, where can people go? Now, I always tell people for this show, patreon.com/the0hour to support your podcast. Where do they go?
It's patreon.com/current affairs, or as I say, if they go to currentaffairs.org, they can read the intro to the podcast, and that will also encourage them to go to our Patreon and become a donor.
All right, very good. And there are so many things we can talk about, but the one thing I can't resist for a couple of reasons. One is I did an extended monologue a couple of weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, about Jordan Peterson. And now you, Nathan, in your piece on Jordan Peterson got an enormous amount of traction, I would say, a lot of conversation around it. It was an excellent piece about, oddly enough, of all things, a writer friend of mine is a close friend of Jordan Peterson's. But I want to start out with a proposition that my friend, who is a friend of Jordan Peterson's, would not like so much, which
Okay.
is, but I want to share with you one of the things and get your thoughts in that monologue, which is, we quoted, are they coming for you? We quoted, we actually played an audio of Jordan Peterson saying that, of course, he doesn't think women ought to be harassed in the workplace, but lipstick was a sign of sexual arousal, and heels and dresses and so on were promoting sexual desire, and so people should not be surprised or, I suppose, particularly complain at the outcome. Not that he, and this is the whole using evolutionary biology to justify certain
Right.
retrograde social ideas. And I just couldn't help but observe that as Jordan Peterson was making those comments, he was wearing a tie, which is evolutionary signaling for having a large male sexual organ. And
It's an arrow pointing downwards.
it's an arrow. It's saying this side up, I think, is what it said. And he was also wearing the reinforced shoulders and a sport jacket, which is a sign, a signifier that you are physically stronger than other males in the room and capable of dominating them. So I suppose, is it incumbent upon Jordan Peterson to accept as inevitable if I, for example, were to walk up in response and punch him in the face?
Yeah. See, this is the thing that he does, and there's the sneaky thing about this, right? Is that he says, "Well, I'm not endorsing it. I think," I use the example of when he talks about violence against women, where he does a sort of similar thing, where it's like, "I think it's bad. I think it's horrible. I think it's terrible." However, I also give you all these reasons why it's sort of natural or expected. And then elsewhere, he'll sort of imply that things that are natural are also kind of justifiable, and he'll blur the lines. And when he talks about lobsters, he's talking about social hierarchies and social dominance, and he sort of suggests, well, these things are inevitable. And if they are inevitable, well, that gives you sort of less grounds to complain about them. And I think that's somewhat disturbing when he does that, right? And I think it gives signals to people that say, well, on the one hand, he says, though, I deplore all these horrible things, but then he's giving you all these explanations for why it's sort of the way things have to be. And he'll say, I'm not a sexist. I think women can do lots of things. But then he'll say, oh, well, there are these natural hierarchies of talent, and the people who rise to the top rise for good reasons, and there are evolutionary explanations. So there's this thing, the naturalistic fallacy, which says, because something is natural, it's good. And he always finds ways to insist that that's not the thing he's doing, but it often does seem like the sort of thing he's doing, and I think people interpret it. His fans, I think, often interpret it as the thing he's doing. And I gave the example of there's a video he has about violence against women, and if you look at the comments section, it's absolutely horrible. Now, he doesn't say in the video that he endorses hitting women, but I can tell you a large portion of the commenters were like, yeah, when a woman gets out of line, you've got to put her into her place with force if necessary.
You know what's fascinating about that to me, Nathan, I was just thinking as you were talking, was this is a guy who presents himself as an arbiter and representative of responsibility. Make your bed, be a productive citizen, do what needs to be done. And yet this is all a kind of permissiveness of a massive scale. It seems to me there's a dimension of permissiveness in it anyway that basically says, well, no, you shouldn't violate social norms, you shouldn't commit violence, you shouldn't break the law, you shouldn't commit violence against women, but it is your natural state to do so, and they share some of the responsibility if they stimulate your natural urges. In other words, while he talks about responsibility, it seems to me that he absolves his followers of responsibility for their most atavistic and primitive impulses. Does that make sense to you?
I think that's a really interesting way of putting it because, yeah, as you say, he's giving self-help advice, supposedly, right? And his big thing is, well, clean your room, get yourself into shape. But he never says, and he doesn't do anything that implies that you have to be more generous and kind to people, or more understanding. He's not an empathetic person, right? So he doesn't really try to understand where his critics are coming from, why some of the things that he says horrify people. He's not self-critical. He likes telling people what to do, but he's not encouraging them to be more humble, or to look at or to, as you say, take responsibility for things that they do that are deeply harmful. That thing with the workplace and, well, women wear makeup and how can we help but harass them, sort of, is the underlying message. It's like, well, even if you prove, this is another thing he does where he gives you evidence that doesn't actually support his conclusion, right? Even if you could come up with an explanation and say, well, makeup is designed to be sexually attractive, does that justify crossing lines with people that they don't want to have crossed? Everyone wants to be attractive, but that doesn't license people to assault us. And it's those people's responsibility not to assault us, even if we have made ourselves incredibly attractive. Just as if someone is weak, that doesn't give you license to bully them, right? Your responsibilities are your responsibilities. So it's a good point that he's not really talking about personal responsibility in an important way.
Yeah, and again, we're talking with Nathan J. Robinson of Current Affairs, and I'm fascinated by this reliance on the lobster as a model of human behavior. It reminds me, Conrad Lorenz, there was a great piece in the New York Times Book Review many years ago about Conrad Lorenz, the zoologist, the famous zoologist who grew up in basically 19th century Prussian culture, even though he was a 20th century historical figure. He wrote this whole piece about the behavior of the male goose toward the gander, and how the male goose's walk was upright and his shoulders were back. In other words, the male goose was almost the perfect representative of a 19th century Prussian man. And it seems to me that the male goose seemed like a stretch at the time, that there was a lot of projection going on here. But the lobster is really, looking to the lobster as a social role model is really stretching things a bit. I mean, how does one justify in one's own mind, well, it's what lobsters do?
Well, I mean, if that's the way that we're going to start reasoning, then women could say that the existence of the praying mantis gives them license to eat their husbands. But we don't think of it that way because we understand that the animal community is a brutal and violent place often, and that animals don't have a moral sense in the same way that we do, and that all of the discussions about morality that we have occur because we are uniquely moral beings who are capable of thinking about our responsibilities toward one another, and dignity, and what people are owed, and what they ought to do. And so, yeah, I think it's a very lazy way of reasoning. Of course, everything you see Jordan Peterson, every time I say something about Jordan Peterson, I get an email going, that's not what he says, because he always couches it and says something somewhat contradictory different. So he says, I'm not encouraging people to be like lobsters, I'm just saying they are like lobsters, right? But then also he says, he has language suggesting that you should look to the lobster. So he's a very slippery guy. And I think that's true of a lot of people who develop these kind of cult followings, is that they say things that have a lot of different interpretations so that the audience can project whatever they want to onto it. So I say in my article that you can pick your Peterson. Right? If you want to think of Peterson as a classical liberal, there's evidence for that. If you want to think of him as a fascist, there's evidence for that. Because there's just so many different things in his large body of spewed words.
That point about it's a very interesting point. You know who else, by the way, is very slippery? Lobsters. They are a slippery creature, and I hope they never organize against us, because my French grandmother was extremely cruel to lobsters. I don't even want to go into it. But okay, enough about Jordan Peterson. Again, we're talking with Nathan J. Robinson. Fascinating guy, fascinating phenomenon, I would say, the Jordan Peterson phenomenon. You've also talked about, well, let me start this way. There was a song from one of the few, I think, redeeming songs of the 70s was by Dan Hicks and the Hot Licks, called How Can I Miss You When You Won't Go Away, which is sort of, it comes to mind when I think about the people that are being lionized as the intellectual dark web, who folks you have also written about. There's this entire mythology that's been built up. That's I think your piece was called "Pretty Loud for Being So Silenced." What is going on? Why is it that I'm surrounded by people who tell me there's a cacophony of voices telling me that there is no cacophony of voices because they've all been silenced. They're in every major media organ everywhere I look. What is behind this paradox?
Well, there is this quote that I like, which is sort of when you're used to privilege or when you're used to being at the top, everything, the erosion of that privilege feels like oppression, right? Which is, so it feels, because there are more people in the discourse, because it's more open, it does feel to a lot of these people like they are being shut down. But I think we have to look at it sort of, I hate the word objectively, but we have to try and look at it factually, which is to say, well, is the central complaint being made by Charles Murray and by Jordan Peterson and by Sam Harris and Ben Shapiro, is that correct? And their central complaint is that their ideas are pushed out, that they're dangerous, that they are. Peterson disavows the word silenced, but he does say that it's like a sort of cultural Stalinism that is intolerant of dissent. And in Barry Weiss's profile of the, quote, intellectual dark web in the New York Times, she says that they have been purged. She uses the word purged from mainstream institutions. But of course, if you look at the media, we hear from these guys all the time. They're on HBO, on Bill Maher. They go on MSNBC, on Joe Scarborough. They're in the New York Times, the liberal. So they're not just in the Wall Street Journal and the National Review, but the liberal New York Times. It doesn't have a socialist columnist or a Bernie Sanders supporter as a columnist, but it's got Bret Stephens and Barry Weiss as columnists, and all they talk about is how campus activists are shutting down free speech in this country. And I think. So I think it's and they all get book deals. They all get, Milo Yiannopoulos got a $250,000 advance from Simon & Schuster for writing a book called Dangerous about how the left was trying to destroy him. Ben Shapiro has a big book called Bullies. So just factually speaking, their central complaint is I think difficult to sympathize with. And the other point there, though, is that there are people who are pushed out of the discourse. There are ideas that don't get paid attention to, but I think they're left ideas rather than ideas about than conservative ideas.
Well, you wrote about that. It's a fascinating co-optation process that's taking place, I think, and this whole conversation brings it up for me. Co-optation step number one to me is when people who are espousing profoundly establishment and insider ideas present themselves as outsiders. I think of Michelle Rhee, for example, the charter school advocate, very well funded by, that whole movement, very well funded by billionaires and so on, calling her book radical, meaning herself. She is a radical for wanting to corporatize the public school system. Or you mentioned Milo Yiannopoulos calling his book dangerous. He's dangerous for spreading ideas that are encouraged by, very powerful individuals and forces in society. That seems to me almost, I'm just speculating here, but step one is to sort of posit yourself as an outsider and a rebel. And step two is whenever anyone comes along in some tiny platform somewhere, relatively speaking, and says, gee, I don't think I agree with that, then silenced. Then it's bullies, then it's, banned, then it's there, I won't be silenced and all that. Is that what we're seeing here, a kind of three-card Monty where those who speak for the powerful are presenting themselves as silenced rebels because that's part of our mythology of heroism or something?
Yeah, partly. I mean, there is a certain to do them to be as fair to them as I can. It is also true that I understand why it may feel that way if you're a Republican student at Oberlin, say, right? If you are on a liberal arts college campus, then it's true that if you voice conservative ideas, people might be appalled and you might lose friends. But the important point is that liberal arts colleges aren't the world. And there's often this substitution of anecdote for data, where this really is, to the extent that this thing happens, it really is a few incidents at a few elite colleges. Now, there are thousands of colleges and universities in America, and usually they can point to about 5 or 6 instances a year where a speaker is shut down or disinvited because of left-wing agitating. And oftentimes the speaker actually ends up coming anyway. Charles Murray spoke at Harvard and Yale last year. He gave his address and people listened and they asked critical questions, and that was that. So one point is, to the extent that there may be some claim where there are places where it does feel like you're a minority to be a conservative, it's ignorant of the way power actually works, right? Donald Trump is the president of the United States. The Republicans control the Congress. There is just absolutely no way in which the ideas that you're voicing are anti-establishment. If you want to talk about anti-establishment ideas that nobody will listen to and that get pushed out, well, we've tried writing about violence in Mexico and the Saudi bombing of Yemen. Nobody wants to read about that stuff, right? Because that's about people that Americans don't really have much empathy for, and issues that are sad and depressing and that nobody wants to click on and suffer through. So those are the kinds of things, and police violence and poverty, and there are plenty of things that do get pushed out, but I don't think they realize that, because I do think they're so oblivious. I don't think Sam Harris, for instance, is even aware. I said that black intellectuals exist because he never has any of these social justice people on his program. He says, well, I have lots of debates with people who disagree with me. Well, he doesn't have any debates with the people who actually disagree with him. So I think those people are so silenced and pushed out that these conservatives aren't even aware of the set of ideas that really are unheard.
Well, Robert Wright wrote, I thought, a very good piece about Sam Harris, where he pointed, and I think Sam is emblematic of a certain type of person that we're talking about here. Bill Maher is another who basically what they do is they perform an intellectual jujitsu where anyone who disagrees with them, they immediately stereotype and dismiss. So if they do happen to come across someone who offers a contrary point of view, they say, well, you're just saying that because it makes you feel good, because it's what everybody's supposed to say. You're virtue signaling or whatever. I had my own experience with Sam Harris back in 2007. We were on a panel together about faith and progressivism, and he was saying that all religion leads inevitably to extremism, and I told him about the work of Martin E. Marty at the University of Chicago. And Marty and his group had done an extensive study. We could talk methodology, but they'd done an extensive multi-country survey about extremism and found that the levels of extremism within each religion were pretty stable, including Islam, about 20%. And I won't go through all the different breakdowns, and that they were relatively stable over time, absent outside factors. And I said in the course of the panel to Sam, would you at least take a look at that and see if that influences your ideas? And he said no.
Yeah.
And I wrote it up for the Huffington Post, and the comments section was filled with one comment from a Sam supporter. "Kick him again, Sam," was one of the was a characteristic quote, meaning that it's kicking me to refuse to look at data. It's a way of winning an argument. So I think there's the lack of exposure you talk about, and I appreciate your willingness to impute goodwill on people, but I also think it's a refusal to consider data that might undermine your point of view, which we may all be guilty of to a greater or less extent at some point, but I think it becomes systematic after a certain point. I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, that's what Robert Wright pointed out very well in this article, Sam Harris and the Myth of Perfect Reason, or whatever it was called, where he pointed out that Harris actually uses what are sometimes elementary logical errors of reasoning. And the example Wright used was, he said, Harris says, well, poverty and alienation couldn't have anything to do with radicalization because look at all these poor places where there isn't radicalization. And Wright says, well, that's like saying that because some people who smoke don't get cancer, smoking doesn't cause cancer. And it's something that is very obvious if you think about it for a second. But in order to notice that, you have to be committed to self-scrutiny. You have to be committed to examining your own arguments to see if they hold up. And this is one thing that Harris never does. When he wrote his book, The Moral Landscape, which supposedly proved that science could determine moral values, and surprise, surprise, science turned out to prove that the things that Sam Harris believes are all the objectively correct moral values. When he wrote this, he got a lot of criticism from moral philosophers who said who pointed out that the things he was saying were just elementary points in moral philosophy, or they were erroneous. And Harris said, "Well, I don't read moral philosophy because it's boring." And so that's the kind of thinking. And Harris really hates the term scientism, but I think it's a really useful word to describe what he's doing, because science and reason are fundamentally about doubt. They are about taking things that seem obvious and scrutinizing them and looking for the data and trying to figure out what we can actually prove and getting past our biases. And Harris's view of science seems a lot more, in practice, I mean, he'll affirm in theory that it's about doubt, but in practice, it sounds a lot more like confidence and arrogance and explaining to people rather than listening to and observing the world. I don't get the sense that he goes into a discussion like trying to shed himself of his preconceptions. He goes into a discussion trying to, as that commenter said, trying to kick them, and Shapiro does the same thing. He's trying to destroy, to try and vaporize, to try and own, right? And I don't think that's scientific. I don't think it's conducive to truth-seeking. And my model for truth-seeking is, of course, Socrates, who's, the only thing you know is how little you know, and you have to go around interrogating knowledge rather than just espousing it loudly and telling everyone who disagrees with you how stupid they are, what an imbecile they are. I mean, Sam Harris uses this kind of language, calling people morons and imbeciles and such.
Well, and I guess, I didn't expect to go here, but in the few minutes we have left, Nathan J. Robinson, and it's something I haven't written about in many years, and I don't know if you've written about it a lot, but this notion of, if you want to call it scientism, that's fine, but I believe that there is, among a certain type, Sam Harris is a perfect representative of it, in a certain type of pseudoscientific, I would say, imperialistic atheism, represented by Harris and the late Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins. I would say there is an underreported aspect. A lot of people have written about the new atheists and so on, but an underreported aspect of their intellectual movement, to me, is a deep. You're a sociologist. Is a deep-seated hostility to the social sciences and a belief. When Sam Harris says, "I don't read the moral philosophers," I think there's a deep-seated hostility to the liberal arts and the social sciences. This nonsensical notion of memes, for example, which basically replicates in an artless way the work of cultural anthropologists and others of many decades, in a simplistic way. The notion that biological or quote-unquote hard sciences have known no more than the social sciences about the social sciences, and no more than liberal arts about human nature. Therefore, there's no need to study any of that. It must be subjugated because we are free of bias. We are free. Our biases are invisible to us because we don't believe we have any. Therefore, you should simply all yield to our process of analysis. Does that make sense to you as a sort of condition?
Definitely, and I think you see this with the way Sam Harris approached Charles Murray, right? So Sam Harris had Charles Murray on his program, and he presented Murray's ideas as these sort of forbidden and shut down ideas. And the thing that Ezra Klein of Vox then pointed out to Harris that made Harris very mad was that actually these aren't they aren't forbidden ideas. They've been voiced. Murray's ideas have been voiced through all of American history. They're very, very common. And in fact, there are very strong responses from people in the social sciences. I have written a long article, 7,000 words, going through Murray's entire body of work and explaining why I think it's accurate to call it racist, why it's very obvious from the text that he believes in notions of cultural superiority and believes that racial subjugation is okay. It's very evident if you actually read his work and don't just accept the mythology. And people in the social sciences have taken that work very seriously, and a lot of sociologists have engaged with Charles Murray's work at length. But Harris hasn't read any of that because, as you mentioned, there's this kind of contempt for everything other than the hard sciences, as if they're all we have. They're the only uses of reason, and I think there's a conflation between the word reason and science. Which isn't the case. So many fields use reason, right? I mean, mathematics uses reason, and it isn't science. The sociology uses reason. Moral philosophy uses reason. But they think that empirical data is all it is, and yet paradoxically aren't actually willing to look at the data. And what you see that this leads to, I think the imperialism point is very important, because Harris has said things like, well, the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, for instance, well, yes, that was bad, but it's distinguished because it's an exception, and we're so good, and we're good people, and the fact that we're horrified actually shows how good we are. Well, that shows a lack of an ignorance of history too. History is another thing they don't read, because he clearly doesn't understand anything about the Vietnam War, right? He doesn't understand the level of death and suffering and the gross American indifference to it. And actually, if you appraise the Vietnam War honestly, the whole war is a serious indictment of America's claim to be good and to be concerned about others. But they just don't want to hear this, because they say this is what, if you're convinced that you're perfectly reasonable, then disagreement and doubt feel like conspiracy, and they feel like being anti-science.
And and unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But also, if you look at the history of the Vietnam War, you will see it as a refutation of the notion that reason and rationality can stand apart from morality and ethics and conversations that belong to the social sciences and the liberal arts. The title, "The Best and the Brightest," for David Halberstam's book was meant to be ironic, and Robert McNamara's story is the story of a guy who believed in a quantifiable approach, ultimately going completely off the rails and taking two nations with him. Unfortunately, though, we're going to have to leave it there. But as always, Nathan J. Robinson, great to talk to you. The Current Affairs magazine is going great, and best of luck on the Current Affairs podcast as well. Thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks so much, RJ.